Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. Today is going to be a long and challenging one because today we are drawing Swamp Thing. And I'm going to obviously be talking about detailing. And I've also for some reason deigned to do a background this time, which I don't really do backgrounds, especially full detail ones, all that often these days. So yeah, I've got to do a full background here. Including water, which is challenging to draw. Sometimes it depends on how you do it. We'll talk about that whenever it comes up. But yeah, so I've also got to worry about that, and then I'll also have to be doing some patterning because we're doing foliage and stuff like that. Which, granted, we can bend some rules. We can use some brushes to deal with a lot of foliage and stuff like that. But nonetheless, this is going to be challenging, time-consuming, and probably the longest one I've done in a very, very long time. So yeah, lighting's also going to be a thing we have to worry about. I'll get to that. It's going to be a long one. So strap in, folks. We'll be here for a while. Let's hope you're interested. So anyways, I will roll my intro and then I'll show you what I have. So for now, I'll just show you what I have with the character, because I'll introduce that background stuff in a moment because it's a bit messy in base sketch because I don't need to be detailed with a background, particularly in base sketch. I just sort of need to give myself the impression of things. So I'll cover that in a minute. I'll get to that in just a second. I'll go over the character stuff first. So, as I mentioned, this is detailed and very challenging. The base sketch alone took a very, very long time to draw, and it's because whenever you're drawing sort of plant bits and stuff like that, you need to use a variety of different types of brush stroke. So for example, whenever you're doing the sort of longer leaves, almost like palm leaves here, they're not exactly palm leaves, but let's just say for example that they're like that. When you're using longer reeds and stuff like that, they need to remain thick and consistent and have a clean line. So you have that type of line. Then you have this sort of moss and then bits of actual like leaves in there as well. So you can tell the difference between the moss and then the leaves, because this is all moss down here, but then these are actual leaves on the middle of his chest. And the reason why you can tell that is because there's less lines on the chest than there are on the moss. The moss itself is lots of little tiny lines that then build up into this sort of there's just a car honk there in the background. I don't know if you heard that, but yeah, anyways, when it comes to the moss, there's these sort of little building clumps of little lines that sort of form into this constant tiny little cluster of bits, and then whereas the leaves, there's more separation. There's clearly more sort of distance between everything. Things are more separated out. And then yeah, he's got these bits of the reeds coming through his shoulders, along his neck, and then into the sort of moss, and then into the little bits of like almost the barky sort of texture which he has on his sort of abs. Here, which has a different texture than his thinner lines that sort of have these sort of tattered edges and stuff like that, which you can see along here. It's the same with his sort of musculature on his arms. They have that sort of texture. Then there's the little bits of sort of reeds that sort of wrap around his fingers and then fall off into these. Here it's more moss along his fingers. Here it's more sort of little bits of reeds that are falling down here. And so we've got all these different textures. Then we have the sort of the legs, which are going to be very hard to draw because it's mostly moss. It's mostly moss, and then these sort of coiling bits of sort of branch and bark, and then reeds and vines and stuff like that are all falling off of him. And that's just on the character. There's the head as well, which has these sort of it's more consistent in shape, but he has these sort of little bits of reeds and moss along his face as well to give him this sort of like almost beard shape along the edge of his head. But he's got the very distinct sort of like almost mask shape to the way that his sort of the skin in his nose pushes up and back like that. And all you can really see is just the little breath holes, and then he's got obviously his mouth, which is very unusual. But yeah, his head has to be a sort of an inconsistent shape because there's bits of the sort of moss and gunk that are just sort of like cracking off and falling into a different shape. And again, this is the problem whenever you're drawing a monster. This is, I suppose, something that's worth noting here, is whenever you're drawing a monster character, they kind of have to look a bit gross, and even with Swamp Thing, he's supposed to look a bit gross. So in order to create that, there has to be lots of detail. Detail is very much conducive to creating over-detailing can make something seem really gross. For example, whenever you add way too many lines to someone's face, it can look kind of bad. But if that's what you're going for, you can work with it and you can make a character look kind of gross by over-detailing them. And I find, at least, that having too many lines on a character can make them look a bit gross, specifically on their face, specifically if they don't really need them. Especially if you go in and you do like those little bits of hatching along certain areas, and then you add all these more and more and more superfluous and extra lines that really don't need to be there. If that's the thing that you're intending to do, you have to make it very obvious that that's what you're intending to do. You have to sort of overemphasize it a little bit so that it's obvious that that's the intention. But here it's very much the same sort of thing, of where he's got all these extra lines on his face which he really doesn't need, that sort of emphasize and add to him looking a bit gross. And it's very much the case on the legs, of where it looks kind of gross, because there's bits of sort of it almost sort of blends together in ways that it's hard to discern what's going on, which is a challenge to draw. But yeah, so that's a lot of the character stuff really there. But yeah, there's the water, which I've just sort of filled in as an impression, because he's sort of in, like, I don't want to say ankle deep, but he's in sort of like halfway up the calf kind of deep water. And so realistically speaking, a lot of this is going to be in shadow, so I don't need to worry too much about it. The water is mostly going to be dark, so I don't have to worry too much about it being detailed. I don't have to detail it too much. I can mostly sort of go in with a brush and just sort of add bits that make it look a bit foamier, or make it look a little bit messier, or stuff like that. And yeah, it's going to be dim, dark water, so it has to sort of have that darkness to it. Now I have to talk about the background. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to look a bit messy for now. We'll worry about more of that later. So I'm going to have some bushes and stuff like that. Again, that's just all this is. I'm going to be using brushes, separate brushes for this. This is just here just for the sake of knowing what I'm doing. I'm going to have some bushes and brush in front of the camera there. I also have these vines falling down, the bigger ones falling down from out of frame, and have little bits of sort of branch framing everything. And again, having that little frame around things can focus your eye, and that is a very big use of a foreground and background, is that it can focus your vision. It's very useful in doing so. So what I'm going to do is, most of these trees here in the background are going to be in pure shadow. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to have a mist in the background there, and that will also conceal the edge of the water line here, which I've just put in for my own reference really, because you're not going to be able to see it in theory. I'm going to have some sort of mist, some low-hanging sort of fog that'll hang around the edge of the water back there, so you won't really be able to see the delineation all that much. And then I'll have these trees in the background be mostly just shadow. So that's why they're not detailed or anything like that. They're mostly just going to be in shadow, so I just put in the shape of them and then left in the little marks of areas where you'd be able to see through, little holes in the brush, little holes in the sort of sort of leaves and things like that, which again you would be able to see through bits of these, especially if it's a sort of a wall of trees. There would still be little sort of areas which you can see through a little bit, little areas which aren't quite fully concealed. And then there's obviously all the branches and the vines and stuff, and there's the bits of shrubbery and moss and gunk like that. It's just all hanging down. Again, the swamp is sort of gross, so emphasizing that here will be worth doing. But yeah, the water is something which is going to be a pain, but mercifully it's mostly undisturbed water. The only water that's being disturbed is around his feet, but he is supposed to be moving, so that should sort of be rippling back a little bit. He's supposed to be in the process of walking through it, so we'll see how I feel about that as I'm going. But yeah, I can turn off the background for now because we don't need to worry about it for a while. But yeah, as I mentioned, this is going to be a hard one. I'm going to have a lot a lot of bits to be doing and worrying about and thinking about, and all those little bits of things and gunk and vines and all this crap to think about. And yeah, I mean, there's even like there's little vines hanging off them where there's separation from the body and the vine and stuff like that. Like even here, it's the same thing. There's like little bits of moss and stuff hanging off of it, but it is very much separate from his body. So there's lots of that. There's little vines that move through his legs. There's all these extra things. But yeah, it's going to be challenging, time-consuming, and it's going to be also very difficult to avoid things getting a bit just messy. Because things are messy. This is a messy design. I'm not sure how an artist could do a whole comic of this, but granted, I think more often than not, a lot of comic artists are significantly faster than I am, and also, well, by nature they kind of have to be, but also, generally speaking, a lot of the time they conceal Swamp Thing in shadow. They do a lot of him in shadow. You don't get a huge amount of full body shots of him. You get like a close-up every now and then. But yeah, there's also corners that you can cut with this. You don't have to put in all this detailing of the moss and all this stuff. I'm just doing it because I think it looks cool. But you really don't have to do that. I would, as a matter of fact, recommend not doing it, because this took a long time just to do this base sketch. So doing the full details here is going to take even longer. So this is going to take a few settings, is what I'm telling you. But regardless, let's get on with it. I will, yeah, I think I will just sort of do these details and then I'll be back to do the colors. However long from now that will be, because I do also have to draw the background in this section as well. I'm not going to do all of it because there's lots of foreground elements which will be done in different brushes, like the sort of the shrubbery that sort of sits in front of the camera, the brush that's there, that I will need different sort of, I'll need to use different brushes and sort of tones for that stuff. So I'll be using pattern brushes and things like that for a lot of this stuff, so we'll deal with that when we get to it. And I mean, there is also going to be lighting stuff that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to have a sort of a, my intention is to sort of have a bit of a, like you're almost, there's a, you know, like tree-lined shadows. So what that would be what I'll have to do is I'll have to layer on the sort of a lot of my leaf pattern brushes over everything and leave them at a lower opacity, so that sort of gives it that sort of spotty leaf texture in the shading, so that you're seeing through like that. Yeah, it gives it that sort of like the light is coming through a tree line. It's not sort of coming in clearly. It's a bit messy. It's unclear. That's the sort of lighting that I'll be going for there, but there'll be still marks of bright lighting and stuff like that on him, because I'm not drawing all this only to conceal all of it. So yeah, anyways, I'll do these details and I'll be back at some point, hopefully. I might not be back. Maybe this will finally be it for me. Maybe this drawing will take so long that it'll consume the rest of my life essence. Anyways, moving on. Okay, so it is now the following day. I did the background and all that stuff as well as my character. Now, the background took a little while. The background is a lot of tinkering with layers and different brushes and stuff like that. Now the water, obviously, is a little bit messy. So the water, I suppose I will talk about first, because what I did was I did a few different ink wash brushes, and then I used some different brushes to sort of erase in and just sort of give it this sort of inky dark look. Because whenever the colors go over that, whenever the sort of murkier colors go over that, and then the paints go over that as well, that will then sort of come out as a little bit better looking, because as it stands, it looks alright. I left in little bits of the brush going over the edge here, because you won't be able to see the edge anyways, so it doesn't really matter. And then there's the sort of tree line in the background and stuff like that, and there's the little holes in the line and all that stuff. I just lowered the opacity on the far background so that you can still see the little bits of branches and vines falling down in front, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see them because they're all black, so it would just sort of blend together. But a lot of that background stuff is more of later's problem. So, as you may have seen, it took quite a while to draw in all this moss and all these little bits of detailing and vines and all this stuff dangling off of him and then into the water below, and then yeah. So, needless to say, I don't think I'm going to be drawing much more Swamp Thing from here on out. But you know, if this is the one time, we may as well make it worth it. So now we got to do the colors. So what I might do here as a means of sort of making my life easier, and also just making things look a little better, what I might do is I might just do his green as all the one color, and then I'll interlace some paints into that to sort of disperse it into different shades, because in all the reference images I'm seeing here, he tends to be a reasonably consistent color, with only certain areas having little bits of sort of brownier bits, or sort of like deeper, darker greens, or sort of lighter greens and stuff like that intermixed in. So what I might do is I might go over with some sort of finer brushes in afterwards and just sort of tidy it up a little bit, but otherwise this green will all be the one color. Just to sort of, again, keep things a little bit more consistent, tidy things up a little bit. And we'll see how that looks. I might change my mind on it, but we'll do the colors. His eyes are obviously going to be separate. They're red, so I don't have to worry about that. That's why I'm doing the eyes first. I have a separate layer here for background color, but I'm thinking about it. The only background color is the background itself, and then there's the water. So I'm just going to delete that folder. I don't need it. Because yeah, the only part of this which is actually going to paint on it is the water. That's the only like background color that will actually have paint going over it. So there's no real need to spend too much time worrying about that. Is there anything else I really need to cover here? The background itself, like I'll just sort of probably throw in a black color, and then there'll be some paint that'll sort of work through it. I might add like a maybe a bluish color to the background, like a deep blue or something, just so that then disperses a little bit more, because we don't want this to just be a mess of greens, because it's going to be very hard to parse if it gets down to that. Once our gradient maps and everything go on, I'll have to think of what I'm going to do in terms of color grading and all that stuff at the end, but we'll worry about that later. For now, I'll do these colors, and then I'll be back to do the painted shading, which, you know, might be really long or might be really short. We'll see. Depends on how much work of this, how much of that work is done here, because I'm going to be interlacing paints into the colors. So we'll see. Anyways, I'll do this and all of that, and then I'll be back. So yeah. Okay, that's the colours done. I started almost to get into the level of doing more background elements, or more sort of painted elements, because I did the bushes at the front and those were all sort of separate brushes. But I tried to not have them overlap with things too much, but also make it clear that this is foreground, so they overlap a little bit with his leg. And they cover some other foreground elements a little bit, like some of the vines at the corners they cover a little bit. But yeah, so I did, obviously I went through and I did all the, oh yeah, you might also notice that I did the over, the sort of brush in front of everything, sort of the shadows. I didn't put it over the sort of far background because you shouldn't be able to see that kind of shadow that far away. I put it over the the water because it should sort of be showing up there a little bit. But what I might do is I might erase some of that out with a sort of a softer brush, just so it sort of blends away a little bit. Just so that it's a little bit subtler. But yeah, so I went through. I'll turn it off just for the purposes of this, seeing what I'm doing. But yeah, so I went through. I did obviously my whole green over everything, and then I went through with the paintbrushes and sort of layered in some different kinds of greens. So you've got these sorts of the darker, sort of grosser greens that go for the vines and the sort of barkier bits and harder bits of his body, and then I've got the sort of the more sort of pleasant floral green, which covers a lot of the bushes and sort of the fungus and moss and stuff on him, the deeper green. And then there's a sort of a paler sort of middle tone green that I layered over some of the leaves and the kind of main sort of core bits of his body, a little bit on his face and stuff like that. But yeah, so what I will probably do is I'm going to have to do a few different layers of shadow on this, which I might do those later. I might do those in the next section. I might do those in the detailed shading section. So for the painted, I'm going to be doing a sort of a darker part. It's going to be mostly dark on the top of him, and then it'll be a little lighter coming up from the bottom, because that's sort of more menacing lighting. There'll be a bit more light around his sort of face, but otherwise it'll be mostly dark. Even a lot of his face will be kind of shadowy. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to put in a layer of sort of dark mist along the background here that will then kind of cover that separation between the background and the water, just that it sort of, again, separates it out a little bit. I might do a sort of a dark mist as well in the background just here as well. But yeah, I might put in some light shafts. I might have to think about that, just so that sort of has something going on there to sort of cover these sorts of areas, but that's maybe later as well. So what I'll do is I want to put a sort of a layer of a shadow layer just over the top of him, just like a little dark gradient over the top of him, and then put a light gradient just around his eyes, just so there's a little bit of an eye light there, and then maybe put in some paint of the kind of red emanating out a little bit, give it a little bit of a glow. His eyes don't really glow, but I just want to have that stand out a little bit more, so I might do something like that. See how that works. See how it looks. No reason not to experiment. We're in that territory now. But yeah, I'll add in my sort of fog and stuff into the background. But yeah, so I wanted to sort of worry about... I also have to sort of thin out some of this a little bit. But yeah, so I want to do my painted shading. I want to do some sort of, again, little bits of sort of separate layers of shadow over him. I also need to shade the water. I'll need to do that as well to sort of make this area in the back a lot darker and then sort of lighten up the bits at the front a little bit more. I'll have to do that as well. And then I want to worry about some light shafts and stuff like that, but we'll do that maybe later. But yeah, alright, let's have a go at this. Let's do this painted shading, and then I'll be back to do the detailed shading and those little extra bits. So yeah. Okay, so that is our paints done. We've certainly gotten moodier here with our lighting. So I'll be doing my detailed shading underneath the what do you call it? Our sort of layer of overhead shadow and this sort of little bit of light around his eyes. I'll turn it off for now, just the comparison there. I set it to be an overlay, or no, soft light layer, sorry. It's 60% just because I don't want it to be too overbearing. And then I'll turn it off just for now so that I can see what I'm doing. And then there's also the sort of the heavy dark smoke in the background, and there's also the layer of light that I just sort of interspersed a little bit into the water. But yeah, a lot of the water is being sort of concealed by the fog in the background. I mean, without it, it's fine, but it's certainly moodier and more interesting looking with the fog on, I think. And that certainly, again, adds more spooky energy to a lot of this. Yeah, I'll need to get my layers sorted here for my light and dark. I'll actually need to change some things here with this. So I'll make that sort of a brownier colour. Now our lightest should be a sort of a pale green, I think. And then yeah, bring this maybe a little bit more to orange, just so it's not so dark. But yeah, I think that's sort of what we're going to go for. I think, yes, I'll also need to do a little bit of that extra little bit of layer of paint around the eyes. I forgot to do that, but I'll do that during this. At some point I'll just add that little extra layer. I'll do the light shafts as well and see how they look. They might look terrible, but I'll see how they look. Yeah. Yeah, this is coming together well enough, I think. This whole secondary recording has been a lot faster than I expected it to be. I expected this whole thing to take a lot longer, but the details were really long. So, yeah, it took like 3 hours just on that alone. So, I mean, surprisingly, this hasn't been quite as long as I expected it to be, and it's coming out pretty well. So, we'll see how this works in the end. Anyways, moving on. I'll do the detailed shading, the light line, our little bit of smoke and light shafts and little bits of effects and stuff like that. And we'll see how that looks. So yeah. Okay, so that is all of our, that is all of our detailed shading, light line, and various other effects that I wanted to put on, including light shafts and shadows and mists and all this stuff that I decided to throw on after the fact that add to little bits and pieces of things maybe working a little bit more interesting or what have you. These are things that you use to sell a background or sell an environment more effectively. You have to add all these little bits of place to them. So, yeah, things like adding the light shafts or adding the fog or adding all these different things that sort of add more mood lighting or make things look more intense or weird or spooky or all this stuff. They're all very effective in sort of selling an environment a little bit more. I do think that iMist needs to be a little bit lower in opacity, to be honest. I find that's sort of dominating that space a little bit too much there. It just needs to be subtle. It needs to be there because otherwise his eyes are just not quite right. But yeah, it's just too intense. But yeah, so the gradient map that I went with is obviously something that I conjured up on my own. So currently I'm sticking with a soft light at 60% as my primary gradient map. But yeah, it's all green, who would have guessed? But with a tinge of red at the end, just so that our red still pops, because otherwise I feel like that would be getting drowned out a little bit. It'd be a little too washed out for what I want it to be. I want it to be pretty intense. I don't want it getting washed out too much. It's just not going to look red if it gets washed out. So yeah, that's what I decided to do. Decided to do that stuff. So I'll fire on the other gradient maps. So let's make some duplicates here. Let's make this one luminosity. This one's going to make everything a lot dimmer, so we're going to want to make this about like 20%, maybe lower. We'll see if that's 20%. Let's zoom in so I can see what I'm doing here. It's darker below, it's brighter above. Let's leave it above. Now let's make another duplicate. Make this one a color burn. Bring that to about 10%. Can't really tell what it's doing in the middle. I think the top is where that should be. But right now we're getting very dark in terms of our colors. I mean, like this is what we got in terms of gradient maps. That's what it's like before. It's a lot brighter before all this stuff went on. So yeah, we'll try and lighten this up a little bit. But granted, we do want it to be pretty dark. That is where our mood lighting and stuff like that comes in. So yeah, in order for this to all be moody and dark and all this stuff, you do need a certain level of darkness in order to sell something being, you know, moody. But yeah, and again, a big part of an environment is mood, especially whenever you're implementing it into just a grander piece. It should be the background is a big part of your tone, of your image's tone. So that's what we're going for here, of the overall picture's tone. So we want the tone to be pretty dark, pretty moody. Actually, I think we want our texture to be intense here. Set it to 30%. Just because I think I actually want this to look grimy. I want it to look grimy. I want it to have that bayou grime to it. And I think having pretty intense texturing here would definitely do that. Yeah, I like how that comes out. It's definitely a lot brighter with it on, but it's just it's subtle enough of where I feel like the actual texture work of the texture is subtle enough where it's not sort of distracting, especially at such a high opacity. When it's at 30%, that's a good 15% higher than what I would normally have it. I normally have it only at 15%, 20% maybe. A lot of the time, I usually don't even have it that high. Sometimes I even have it as low as 10% or 5% on some of them. I just usually use it because I need a little bit of texturing, a little bit more life to things, and that can help, especially with a lot of effects and things like that. The texture can be very useful in sort of broadening out the sort of giving a bit more depth, giving a bit more visual depth. That's what the texture is very good for. But yeah, I think it hits those light shafts very well. It sort of blends them quite nicely. And adds quite a bit of grime to like the water and stuff like that. That water looks nasty. That's what we want it to look. We want that water to look nasty. We want that to look like the type of water that no one would be caught dead touching. That's the kind of water we want here. And I think we got it more or less. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with this, to be honest. This section alone was still 2 hours just of all these effects and everything like that. So of just the effects and the colors and all this stuff, that's a full 2 hour recording just there alone. So this is a pretty long one all in all, like over 5 hours at this point. So, pretty long. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. I sort of expected. I mean, this one was a bit of an experiment, so I was sort of hoping. I was hoping that it came out well, and I'm pretty confident that it has. I'm happy with it. Um, yeah. Swamp Thing's not a character I would ordinarily draw. I would not normally draw Swamp Thing. That's mostly because of, again, the sheer level of detailing that's gone on here. Again, it was 3 hours just of the details. So, that's the thing. Going through and looking at the sort of final product, a lot of those details are a little bit concealed, but that was sort of the intention. We do want it to sort of peel in and out of the background a little bit. We want it to blend in a touch. He still stands out quite a bit, but just the sort of edges of him here do blend in a little bit into the shadows behind him. Much more so on the screen below me here, because just this is obviously much higher contrast to this screen than an average, monitor screen or something like that. But I think these subtle little bits of light line was a good idea. It does make him stand out a little bit. It also makes the sort of shape of him a little clearer, makes him look a little bigger, to be honest, with it just being sort of little bits of light line along the sort of very edge of him that makes him look a little bit bigger, and also adds a bit more volume to that moss and stuff like that. Makes it look a bit gross. A bit more gross that it's sort of catching light, that it's a little bit like greasy or something, the way that it's catching light. It's not sort of, it's humid, it's a bit wet. Which again, that's the sort of grossness that we want there. It's the same with the sort of little bits of like grime and goop dripping off of his hands and stuff like that. That's the sort of way that we want that to look. And yeah, I think the sort of shadow, the leaf shadows, are actually surprisingly good. I didn't expect them to be quite so useful for some of this stuff. They appear a little bit more strongly here than I had originally thought, but not the end of the world. Yeah, they apply a lot more strongly in some of these areas than I actually realized even, but I'm not going to go adjusting it now. I just sort of like the subtlety of it. It's the type of thing you don't actually even notice, really, unless you know. Unless you can literally see the on and off, it's not the type of thing you particularly notice all that much, because it doesn't really apply to much of his lower body, really. I erased a lot of it with a sort of a soft brush. I erased a lot of the stuff just so that it's a bit more subtle. It blends a little bit more seamlessly in a lot of areas. And again, I think I did that well, of where if you don't know, if you can't literally see it turning on and off, you probably won't see it at all. It's not the type of thing you'd notice really all that much, I'd say. But yeah, I think it came out quite nicely. Yeah, I'm quite happy with this. Yeah, I think I talked about everything I wanted to talk about. I talked quite a lot about the background stuff. I talked about the detailing, the backgrounds, the lighting, the posing, the effects, all that stuff. Yeah, I talked about basically everything I wanted to talk about. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with this one. I'm happy to end it there, I'd say. So yeah, I think I'll just do the outro and then I'll leave you. So with all that said, that is us. If you like the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking it or not. I would of course prefer if you liked it, but I can't make you do that, so do as you would do. It's the same deal if you want to subscribe, go for it. Can't make you, but you know, all I can do is politely suggest it, which I believe I have done. And yeah, if you don't know what the subscribe button is, it's below the video. You already know this, but if you didn't, there's your suggestion. And speaking of suggestions, if you would like to suggest something for me to draw in the future, you could leave a comment down below. Do so politely, otherwise it will most certainly be ignored. And yeah, if you choose to watch the next video, I will see you next time. So, with all that said, that is, I will say goodbye, and I will leave you. So, bye-bye.